Eradication or managing the problem. On Monday afternoon, Cabinet will announce whether or not to slaughter all cows infected with Mycoplasma bovis. Farms around the country are facing restrictions, with 39 properties infected with the disease. The Minister for Agriculture, Damien O'Connor, says farming practices will have to change either way, with both options expected to cost $1 billion. Earlier in the programme, we heard from Van Leeuwen Dairy Group owner Wilma Van Leeuwen, who criticised MPI for its slow and uncoordinated response. Southland-based vet Mark Bryan has witnessed M. bovis in calves firsthand. Conan Young talked to him about eradication versus management and began by asking him what he thought about the way MPI had handled the situation.
It's been, from a ground level perspective, frustrating. I think in their defence that they would say that they wouldn't expect to have 5 or 6 incursions at one time. So they've got M. bovis and myrtle rust and banamia and a whole bunch of things. So they're certainly under pressure. They've had to endure a change of government, I think, which has probably hasn't helped the process. NATE has not been complied with, and it hasn't been supported. To be fair, the previous government didn't really support NATE, and various agencies didn't support NATE, so there's never been any incentive for farmers to really use NATE. Having said all that, a lot of farmers do use it, and they use it very well. NATE in itself has its limitations, but that's a hard thing to work out until you're using it properly, and then when you use it properly, you work out a few limitations. So that's been part of the issue. And so all these things have conspired. I mean, you could probably argue, and this is outside my pay grade, that MPI probably have been under-resourced, for a number of years. And certainly for having 5 or 6 incursions, it's been quite challenging. It comes back to having the ability to draw a map of tracing, irrespective of MPI's resource status or capabilities. If you could draw that map within the first week, you'd very quickly understand what you were dealing with and what you needed to throw at it. So it's quite tricky if you're kind of going a bit blind, and that's probably the most significant thing. We really need to get better in that animal tracking and surveillance. It's always been lacking in New Zealand.
Looking at where things are at now, does that surprise you that Southland was where this started?
If you're building a picture of how disease travels, the first thing you want to know is animal movements and possible risk. And without a clear NATE picture, it's actually really hard. I mean, how would you know where it come from or where it was going to go? And if you look at that map that MPI released last week, if you were able to draw a map like that within a week of the first isolation in South Canterbury, it would very quickly lead you, animal movements, for example, it would very quickly lead you to, hopefully, to where the potential other risk areas were. And that's been the biggest weakness. We don't have that level of NATE compliance, and NATE itself is not a perfect tool. So we're unique in the world, in first world countries, in having a very low level of individual disease, animal disease tracking or surveillance. So it's a weakness. There's no question about that. And if you look at that map that we've got now, 9 months after the event, if we could have done that 9 days after the initial incursion, that would have changed the picture completely.
But in terms of what was happening in Southland, if it was in Southland as early as December 2015, for it not to be discovered for 2 years, I mean, how does that actually happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the farm where it was found in Southland, we don't have any contact with that farm. They're not clients of ours, and certainly the farm in Canterbury where it was found, the vet there, it stood out quite obviously, and the vet was able to see that there was an issue there. So certainly on our farms that we service, we haven't seen anything like that sort of clinical picture. And that's the other really interesting thing, is the clinical picture in adult cows on the initial 2 index farms, or the 2 originally thought to be index farms, was hugely significant, and quite a significant impact in those cows. Awful to see from an animal health and an animal welfare perspective. We haven't seen that on certainly any farms in Southland, but having said that, there's only, I think, we don't get all the details, but there's only a handful of milking properties in Southland that have had been diagnosed with M. bovis, and of those, I think there's only 2 of those that are clients of ours. Now, of those 2, we haven't seen that clinical picture. So it obviously it changes from farm to farm. What we have seen with calves in Southland has been horrific. So the picture in Southland appears to be, certainly from our perspective, is more a clinical picture in calves. So we've seen infection rates in calves of almost 100% from M. bovis, and then death rates of sort of 90%. It's been really horrific. And having said that, we do have some farms that have had M. bovis diagnosed in their calves, and they've had very few signs. So it's a new disease. We've never seen it in New Zealand. We can look to overseas to see how it behaves overseas, but we don't really know how it's going to behave in New Zealand and how it is behaving. So there's a whole bunch that we don't know and need to know about it, really.
And so it's not inconceivable that this could have been on somebody's farm for 2 years and that they had no idea that something was up, that something was awry.
I think it would depend on the clinical manifestation. If it appeared as it had appeared in the initial farms in South Canterbury, I think that would be quite obvious.
If you look at countries where people are living with M. bovis, I mean, bring that to New Zealand, what would that look like? What sort of changes would there have to be made in the way that we farm at the moment to allow that to happen?
Yeah, so living with M. bovis would, I think, completely change how we farm, and I'm not sure it would be for the better. One of our unique advantages is the shear milking system. It's what gets farmers up the ladder, as it were. So we have this constant changeover of farmers who are able to work hard and buy a farm, and that's unique in New Zealand, and that's, I think, what gives it a lot of our competitive edge. We don't have this kind of system where farms are owned by a few people and people just work on them. And so that goal of becoming a farmer and farm ownership drives a lot of ambition and change in New Zealand. That would change completely, because if you're a shear milker and you've got a herd of cows, first of all, if your herd was diagnosed with M. bovis, it's worthless, especially if it's not an eradicable disease. So if there's no compensation for it, your herd is worthless. The only cure for M. bovis, it's not like other diseases like people talk about TB, and we can manage and eradicate TB, but it's a very animal-specific disease. So if you have animals that are positive for TB, you can cull those animals and the rest of the herd's okay. If you have animals that are positive for M. bovis, your whole herd's got to be culled. That's the only way they deal with it overseas. So if you're a shear milker, that becomes worthless overnight. If you're a shear milker and you want to move farms, obviously with a positive herd, no one's going to allow you to come onto their farm. And equally well, if you're a farm owner and you had a positive farm, no shear milker is going to want to come on your farm. So that changes completely. The other change I think that would be significant would be around our antimicrobial use, and we're in a situation where we have announced, the New Zealand Vet Association announced a few years ago that we would like to get to a position by 2030 where we didn't use or didn't have to use antimicrobials. We're in a very strong position in New Zealand. We're the 3rd lowest user of antimicrobials in agriculture in the world, and we're making significant strides to go down to be the lowest user of antimicrobials in the world. If we get M. bovis, that's going to change completely, because you'll have an increase in disease, which farmers will have to treat. M. bovis doesn't respond to antimicrobials very well, so there's going to be repeat treatments, unnecessary treatments, because it's hard to diagnose. We're going to be dealing with something that's hard to diagnose. So, and then of course we've got all the animal welfare issues associated with that. So it's going to significantly impact our industry. And what people tend to sort of forget about, they focus on the dairy industry, but the beef industry, 70% of calves in the dairy industry go into beef. And we've seen the impact it's had on calf rearing, and a lot of these larger calf rearing operations where they get calves from 2 or 3 sources, it jeopardizes that as well. So the beef industry is going to be impacted too.
What's it like for you as a vet, seeing cows with M. bovis and dealing with farmers who are having to see their stock go through this as well?
It's been hard, really. I'd have to say I haven't seen any cows with M. bovis. We've seen calves with M. bovis, and I mean, they're just awful, horrible looking things. with no real, I think the worst bit about it is we know we can't treat them. There's no treatment for M. bovis. The best of them die quickly or a cold, and the worst of them have a horrible slow sort of death. It's been really hard on farmers and hard on the community. I don't think it's been easy on anybody. I mean, to be fair to MPI, it's been hard on them. It's hard on assured quality. It's hard on our vets and technicians. It's hard on people in the community that support farmers, contractors. Everybody's impacted. Truck drivers. It's been a really difficult time. The biggest challenge for Southland for the past 4 or 5 months has been, I think, dealing with the uncertainty. And I think what we're finding now is we're entering a period where there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Virtually every cow in Southland and South Otago has to move off the dairy platform in the next 10 days, and we still don't have a clear picture of how that will happen and what it will mean for farmers under restrictions, or if you're a grazier and you've got a contract to take cows, they're still being tested, they might be put under a restriction in the next week or so. And that lack of clarity is causing a huge amount of stress. It's really quite difficult for farmers who are used to making decisions, 12 months ahead. And here they are in a process where they just can't make decisions even 10 days ahead.
And it's Southland-based vet Mark Bryan speaking to our Christchurch reporter Conan Young.